Hello, and welcome to Time of Death. I'm one of your hosts, Ris.
And I'm Dee.
And if you're new here, welcome. We love to talk true crime. We like to focus on cases that have a heavy medical influence to them, or cases that feature a medical professional as the perpetrator or victim. And of course, for the month of October, we are veering a little bit off path and doing more spooky stuff.
Yes.
But for this episode, we're pretty on point with our typical medical perpetrator committing some pretty heinous crimes. So, without further ado, I'm just going to give a quick couple warnings. First, we will be discussing Stephen King's novel Misery. So, if you haven't read it yet and plan to, I recommend returning to this episode later as there will be some spoilers. We will also touch on sensitive topics such as torture, suicide, and the harm of babies and children, both in the book and in real life.
We actually just finished this book for book club. So I'm really excited Ris chose this case.
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, we do have a book club, an ER book club. And for October, we read Misery by Stephen King. It's very appropriate, very creepy for the Halloween season. And this book, just a little synopsis, it follows Paul Sheldon. He is a famous writer, and his car goes off the road on a snowy winter day.
After drinking a bottle of Dom Perignon.
Yeah, he's a little lit. Anyway, he is rescued by a woman named Annie Wilkes. She is his self-proclaimed number one fan, especially due to her fondness for his dramatic romance series about a Victorian woman named Misery Chastain. With her background as a retired nurse, Annie is the ideal person to nurture Paul back to health. He is bedridden with several broken bones, he can barely move, and is in excruciating pain. Annie medicates him with Novril, which we learn is a narcotic used for pain relief, and in Annie's case, it is often used as a sedative to make Paul more pliable.
Also, Novril is not real in the real world.
Oh, it's not?
No, it's made up.
I didn't know that. Well, I never heard of it, so I thought maybe it was, maybe it wasn't.
Nope, it is a pseudo drug.
Interesting, Dee. So smart. So soon Paul discovers he is a captive in Annie's home. Her temper is volatile, and she resorts to horrific acts of torture, such as hobbling him by amputating his foot with an axe. Don't worry, any infection disease nurses that are listening. She cauterizes the wound with a blowtorch. She also cuts off his thumb, withholds his pain meds, and demands that he rewrite the last novel in the Misery series because she couldn't bear to see her beloved Misery Chastain killed off.
To be honest, I don't agree with what she did, but to request that he writes her favorite novels, like continuation, bringing this character back from the dead. If I rescued a famous author, I would say the only thing you can do for me, the only way you could ever repay me, after they were safely in the emergency room or in the hospital, I'd say, please write that book.
Just do me this one favor and we'll call it even.
Do me this solid.
So and I actually really like his sequel book, like how he goes from the last book where a Misery ends up dying during childbirth. And then the next book turns out she was buried alive. And it's just like, I don't know. I like reading the Misery book while inside of the Misery book, if that makes sense.
That makes absolute sense. I like the bee sting and finding out the connection to her sister and all that good stuff. I think he just did you could tell Paul Sheldon is a great writer.
He is. He truly is. And so during one harrowing moment in the novel, Paul escapes from his locked bedroom with a bobby pin, and he discovers a scrapbook titled Memory Lane. And within it, Annie chronicles her gruesome crimes over the years including the murders of family members, nursing school competitors, and even her patients, including infants that she cared for during her time as a maternity nurse.
Horrific. It's the new Lucy Letby.
Yeah, seriously.
Or the old school Lucy Letby,
Yeah.
I should say.
Realizing Annie is far more dangerous than he initially thought, Paul understands that if he doesn't find a way out, he will meet the same fate as her other victims. Stephen King has said that he was partly inspired by a real-life nurse named Genene Jones. Genene was a pediatric licensed vocational nurse, or LVN, who was committing similar crimes while he was writing his book. So, who was Genene? Who was she?
Tell us.
So, Genene was born on July 13th, 1950. She grew up in San Antonio, Texas, and she was adopted early on by a couple named Richard and Gladys Jones. Richard and Gladys had adopted 3 other kids as well. So she was in a family of 6, and her parents owned a nightclub called the Kit Kat Swim Club. And Genene said that she was especially close with her father growing up. Genene was known for being assertive and for her leadership skills. She was described as serious and a very no-nonsense kind of person, even as a teenager. However, her childhood was marked by tragedy, including the deaths of a brother from cancer, and another brother tried to make a homemade bomb, and that ended in his death as well. When Genene was 17, her father died at age 56 due to cancer. And in 1968, a month before she turned 18, she married her high school love, James Harvey Delaney Jr. After a brief stint as a housewife, she pursued a career as a beautician, and then James was drafted into the Navy, and so they relocated to Georgia in 1970. And in 1972, they returned to San Antonio after having their first child that same year, a son named Richard. However, their marriage began to unravel, and it prompted Genene to file for divorce, and she claimed that James was violent and also physically abusive. Despite a brief reconciliation, their relationship deteriorated again, culminating in another divorce filing in 1974. In 1977, Genene had a baby girl named Heather, but there was confusion over paternity. Genene initially claimed that a man named Ron English was the father, before later stating that Heather was James' daughter, conceived during a brief reconciliation. Genene at this time had been living with her mother and had begun a 1-year-long vocational nursing program at a local college. She did very well and took her licensing exam in October of 1977. Her first job as an LVN was at Methodist Hospital, but she only stayed there for 8 months. She claimed that she had a conflict with a doctor there over patient care and that she was asked to resign as a result. She then worked in the obstetrics gynecology ward at Community Hospital, but she was only there for 3 months before resigning due to her needing minor surgery. In late October 1978, Genene began working in the pediatric ICU, or PICU, at Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas. This PICU consisted of 8 beds and was equipped to care for infants and children up to age 16. She said initially that she was very fearful about working with kids, but she said, "The first baby I ever took care of was a preemie with a dying gut. I picked the kid up and I knew I was going to stay there." Originally, she started on nights, but eventually she was able to switch to the evening shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. Quickly, she established herself as an excellent nurse with a strong knowledge base and an affinity for placing IVs. One doctor remarked that she could put an IV in a fly. However, her personality was polarizing. Some complained that she was loud, aggressive, and crass. She would make inappropriate jokes that not everyone appreciated. But on the other hand, she was well loved by patients and their families and was seen as a comforting and kind presence.
I only know one other nurse that can place an IV in a fly.
Who?
Yes.
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
That's such a good compliment.
That's such a compliment. Genene always gravitated towards the sickest patients, and she would often request to care for them during her shifts.
Mm.
Her emotional response to patient deaths was intense. She would frequently request time alone with deceased children, even before family was allowed in the room.
What?
It was really weird.
That's super weird.
Like, I understand, like, you're grieving. It's traumatic to go through a loss of a patient, especially a young patient.
For before their family.
Yeah, she would, like, sit in the room and rock the children and stuff like that is what was reported. So it's just a little...
Bizarre.
It's a little too much. The first peculiar death occurred in May 1981. A 15-month-old boy named Christopher James Hogada. He had been a resident of the PICU for 6 months. He suffered from a congenital heart defect and pneumonia and diarrhea initially, before being diagnosed with hepatitis in the same month of his death. He suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. And from here, medical emergencies skyrocketed. From May 1981 to December 1981, a total of 10 children died after sudden, unexplained changes. And during all 10 deaths, Genene was right there at the bedside. And Genene would always be visibly devastated over these deaths and emergencies. One day, after a patient's death, another nurse found her weeping in a chair in the ICU, asking, "Why do babies always die when I'm around?" Dr. Robotham, the unit's medical director, was concerned that maybe heparin was being used inappropriately. Children had been exhibiting bleeding problems, like bleeding from suture sites, rectal or oral bleeding. Heparin is a blood thinner, and it is very dangerous if it's used incorrectly. In the past, it was used in very small doses to prevent blood clotting in IV lines, so they began to require double checks when heparin was used. 2 nurses would have to sign when it was given.
Isn't it a high-risk medication?
It is, so I don't know if this is what prompted the change but today, heparin is a high-risk med. In October of 1981, a nurse named Susanna Maldonado approached the ICU's head nurse, Pat Belko, to discuss a very important matter. Too many kids were dying, and these deaths were sudden and unexpected. Susanna was one of the first to notice the suspicious nature of the children's deaths, and she saw the connection between them and Genene. Susanna was a newer nurse. She worked the shift after Genene, so the shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m.
Good job, Suzanne.
Susanna said that the only shift that these deaths were occurring on was the evening shift. And furthermore, they were all dying under Genene's care.
Good for her for saying something.
Seriously. However, Belko, the head nurse, was skeptical, and she brushed it off. She had heard this before. She thought that people were gossiping too much and that there wasn't any concrete proof to back it up. But Susanna was undeterred. She explains that she actually went through their census and uncovered the amount of deaths during sudden emergencies and the nursing shifts they all occurred on. Belko double-checks her findings and figures out that Susanna was right. At that point, Belko talks to the medical director, Dr. Robotham, and they begin a quiet, very private investigation. Meanwhile, children continued to have medical emergencies. In late December 1981, 4-week-old Rolando Santos was admitted for pneumonia. Although initially stabilized, he began bleeding from needle sites, leading Dr. Copeland, who was the attending physician, to test for heparin, which came back positive. On January 10th, the bleeding began again, but this time Dr. Copeland was prepared. He ordered protamine sulfate, which is the reversal agent for heparin, and after treatment, Rolando was transferred to the pediatric ward, and 4 days later, Rolando was discharged home safely.
Good.
Uneasiness and suspicion continued to grow among the staff. The evening shifts soon gained the grim nickname, death shift. While it was difficult to definitively prove Genene's guilt, the medical team, especially PICU doctors, agreed that she should no longer be working in the PICU. The hospital administration decided to shift direction, hiring only registered nurses and asking all LVNs, including Genene, to resign. They offered them glowing recommendation letters or alternative positions. The killing stopped once Genene was gone.
There you go.
So instead of accepting another position, in mid-March 1982, Genene began working with Dr. Kathleen Holland, who was a pediatrician in Kerrville, Texas. Kathleen had heard about the rumors circling around Genene, and she actually refused to hire her multiple times. She even ran into Dr. Robotham, and he warned her to stay away from Genene. But Kathleen reviewed the recommendation letters from her prior hospital and thought that it must not be that serious if they wrote such a glowing letter. So she ends up offering the job to Genene. Just a quick side note, on August 3rd, Genene's LVN license expired because she didn't pay the fees associated with it until November. So Genene was working the entire time at this pediatric clinic without a license. And Genene was able to continue her crimes here, but they didn't fly under the radar as well as they did before. Genene worked there for a short time, like about a month. 7 of their patients during that time had 8 medical emergencies, and 1 died. On August 23rd, 1982, Dr. Holland opens her new pediatric clinic. The second day they were open, 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan came in for the first time. She had had some struggles after birth, but she was doing okay, and Mom brought her in for a case of the sniffles. After they were brought back, Genene comes in and takes Chelsea so that Dr. Holland can talk to Chelsea's mom. And 5 minutes later, Genene calls for Holland. Holland arrives to see Chelsea laying limp on the exam table. Genene explains that they were playing with the ball when Chelsea just slumped over. So little Chelsea had stopped breathing, so they began to bag her. And they begin an IV, and Chelsea ends up seizing. And so they gave Dilantin and called for EMS. She was hospitalized for 9 days, but she did survive, and everyone considered Dr. Holland and Genene to be heroes. So during this time period, these kids are coming in seemingly healthy, seemingly for pretty benign issues, and they're either stop breathing, suffer some kind of respiratory arrest, or they start seizing, or both, and they're transferred immediately to the ER throughout that whole period. That same Chelsea, the little 15-month-old, her mom was actually bringing in her son, Cameron. Cameron had the flu, but per Chelsea's mom, Dr. Holland wanted Chelsea checked out too. Dr. Holland later argues that Chelsea had a cold and was having little spells, which I don't know what that means, but that's what was written, which prompted her to advise that Chelsea be seen as well. Genene says later that Chelsea's mom called in saying that Chelsea was looking blue and that she had had 2 seizures. Once Chelsea got there, they wanted to give her a DTaP vaccine and an MMR vaccine, just childhood vaccines. And Chelsea's mom says that after the first shot, Chelsea started having some difficulty breathing, which Genene said was likely due to pain. And her symptoms got better, so they gave her the second shot. And after the second shot, she got cyanotic, she stopped breathing, and then she started seizing. Apparently, they went to 1 ED, and her symptoms had improved, but Holland wanted her moved to a hospital in San Antonio. So about an hour later, the ambulance started for San Antonio, and Genene rode in the ambulance with an EMT when Chelsea went into cardiac arrest. But unfortunately, Chelsea did not survive. By this point, the ER and the community were so confused. Why were there so many kids coming to the ER for life-threatening events? Dr. Holland and Genene would show up every time and often arrived with an air of chaos. Genene would bark orders at the nursing staff and would be condescending to them. A couple of the doctors got suspicious when, on September 23rd, a patient named Rolinda Ruff came in via ambulance from Holland's office in respiratory arrest. This patient had come in with diarrhea for 2 weeks, and of course things went south quite quickly. When she came to the ER, her color was getting better and she was breathing better. Holland wanted to put in a breathing tube. One of the doctors noticed Rolinda fighting the tube and struggling to raise her arm, which looked eerily like someone whose succinylcholine dose was starting to wear off. Jerky movements that had a purpose, but were uncontrolled in their execution.
Smart doctor to pick that up.
Yeah. So we've talked about succinylcholine before on this podcast, but it is a paralytic. And a brand name for succinylcholine is anectine. And anectine is what's used in Dr. Holland's office, or what she supplies in her office. But furthermore, succinylcholine is a depolarizing neuromuscular blocking agent, and it results in paralysis. So when someone's given a paralytic, they cannot move their body. They can't breathe on their own. It's extremely scary, and oftentimes they will go into respiratory arrest if they're not ventilated. The doctors decided this is too much, and they end up holding a meeting during which they discover Genene's history. And they have another meeting, this time with Holland in attendance, and they question her about her patient's medical emergencies. During the meeting, they ask her about whether or not she keeps succinylcholine in her office, which she replied yes, but they don't use it. And the meeting is cut somewhat short because she gets notified that one of her patients in the ER wasn't doing well. The doctors are all uneasy and are very suspicious, so they decide to involve Texas's Board of Medical Examiners. And they also call the Board of Vocational Nurse Examiners to notify them of their suspicions. The Board of Vocational Nurse Examiners says they can't really do much and go to the police with this info. And finally, after all this time, police are involved and an investigation begins. Meanwhile, Genene notifies Dr. Holland about a bottle of succinylcholine that had gone missing a few weeks prior. Genene says, I found it in a drawer in the exam room, and they had actually purchased another bottle because they thought the first bottle was lost. And Genene says, oh, I compared the two together. They're both full. Neither of them have been used. Dr. Holland thinks, this is weird, and a little seed of suspicion starts to grow. The next day, while Genene left the office to get lunch, Holland does a little exploring of her own and went into the fridge to look at the bottles of succinylcholine. And to her shock, in one of the seemingly full vials, there were 2 puncture marks in its stopper, meaning that someone put a needle in here to draw out meds or put something inside here.
So it's very plausible that she used one needle puncture to take out the med and another needle puncture to put in something else.
Yes, that's true. So she brings this up to Genene, and Genene acts like she has no clue what she's talking about. Her nursing friend Debbie would help out at the office too, and during one of the medical emergencies, Debbie had gotten the bottle out of the fridge. So Genene says, I don't know, ask Debbie. Holland brings Debbie in and asks her, and Debbie was like, I just pulled it out and put it in the room. I didn't touch it. She tells Genene, this doesn't explain the puncture marks in the vial. And Genene says, well, we should just throw the whole vial out. Tell them we never found the first vial. It'll be fine. And Holland is flabbergasted. She goes to one of the doctors that were suspicious of Genene. Later that day, Genene tells Holland that she went to visit Chelsea's grave, the baby who died, and that she took some doxepin, which is an antidepressant. She claims she took more than prescribed and that she was feeling weird, and Holland noticed that she was pretty lethargic. So Holland calls 911, EMS comes, and she's brought to the ER. They pump her stomach. She said that she decided at the last minute to face her problems head on, so that's why she didn't go through with the full handful of the pills. Meanwhile, the doctor helping Holland comes over to see the bottles, and he brings an anesthesiologist to hear his input on the meds as well. They look at the invoices of succinylcholine and see 3 purchases. One on August 18th before their opening, one September 7th when they thought the first bottle was missing, and one on September 20th from the ER's pharmacy. Holland is like, that wasn't me that ordered that. And the invoice was unsigned. And also, where was this 3rd vial? Genene was discharged from the ER, and the next day she shows up for work in her scrubs. And Holland is like, I don't think this is working anymore. And Genene leaves. Later on, Genene writes a letter, and in it she's trying to frame Holland for everything. Genene ends up moving to a trailer in San Angelo with her friend Debbie, and the bottle was fully examined, and it was shown to have been indeed succinylcholine, but it had been diluted with saline. Kathy is a friend of Genene's, and she was living with her briefly in the trailer, and she said that she saw her drawing up a clear solution and injecting children with it on 5 different occasions, right before they began to seize. On March 13th, 1983, Kathy's son starts experiencing respiratory distress, and Jean is there for it. And Genene rushes him to the ER. And on May 8th, which is 2 days before she testified to a grand jury, Kathy ends up seizing herself a couple bites into her dinner. They exhume the body of Chelsea McClellan, and they find the presence of succinylcholine in her tissues.
Wow.
And a couple weeks later, on May 25th, Genene is indicted. Genene went to trial and was ultimately charged for intentionally injecting these children with succinylcholine or another drug, which resulted in the death of 15-month-old Chelsea McClellan and the harm of 5 others: Brandy Benitez, Chris Parker, Jimmy Pearson, Missy Richenow, sorry if I say any of these names wrong, Relinda Ruff, and Jacob Evans.
Poor babies.
She was sentenced to 99 years in prison. That same year, she was charged with the attempted murder of Rolando Santos using heparin and was sentenced to a concurrent term of 60 years in prison. Genene claims during the trial that she wanted to replicate a pediatric ICU through the effects of succinylcholine. The state of Texas had a law that was in place to prevent overcrowding in hospitals, and Genene was set for mandatory release in 2018.
What?
Yep. This was overturned when she was indicted in May 2017 for the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. And Bexar County's district attorney, Nico LaHood, was like, try me. I have more murders I can file for. And he filed them so that she wouldn't be released from prison. In April of 2018, the judge denied a request to dismiss 5 new murder indictments. In January of 2020, Genene accepted a plea bargain and pled guilty to little Joshua's murder. By doing so, the other 4 charges were dropped, and she was sentenced to life in prison. She is eligible for parole in 2037. By then, she would be 87 years old.
Keep her in jail. I don't care if she's in her 80s, 90s, 100s. Keep her ass in jail. These poor babies.
She is one of those people where I don't even see what motive you have for killing these poor babies. It's kind of like the Lucy Letby case. What is your point? Is it attention? Is that what you're trying to get out of killing these innocent children? I don't understand it. I don't know.
We could never understand because we're not warped in that way. We're warped in other ways. Not in that way.
It's true. It's just, I don't know.
It's horrific when you prey on the most vulnerable.
I know.
When people prey on the babies and the elderly, it just makes me sick. You know, or children.
Yeah.
Children too.
And under the guise that she's such a, staunch advocate for these children, and she is the one who's killing and hurting them. It's very disheartening.
said it once, I'll say it again. Those people who nursing is their entire personality, red flag. Red flag. I think I
Thanks,
probably
Steve.
get a lot of heat for that, but it's true. I always look at them a little weird. You are not Florence Nightingale reincarnate.
There's a difference between being like proud of what you do
Absolutely.
and, you know, someone like Genene, where I think she also had like a savior complex and she wanted to show what a good nurse she was, what a hero she was, and it ended up just horrible.
Sociopath.
Yeah.
The classic sociopath. I hope
Anyway.
you spent a long, long time in jail.
Yeah. Well, hopefully.
2037.
Yeah.
She better stay.
Yeah. I hope so.
I hope, because it's for her to be let out and she killed so many. Big travesty.
Yeah. Anyway, that's our case for tonight. Let us know what you thought. If you have any recommendations, we also will listen to your recommendations.
AKA, I'll put it off on Ris.
That's fine. Ris,
Do this.
Ris, do this.
Do this, Ris.
All right, say less.
I need that artistic ability to do what I want.
I need that creative license.
Yeah, I need to try to stretch it. I already have my case done for next week.
Oh my god, I can't with you.
Want to know what it is?
What is it? No, don't tell him. Werewolf. Is that werewolf?
Yes, it is. God damn it. All I had to do was one little sound and you knew.
Dee told me last week when she did the vampire case, Ris, do the werewolf game.
I knew you were. I knew you were.
Well, I told you I wanted to do something related to Missouri.
I know, but still. Say something about werewolves.
I don't know. Seems like a pretty hairy conversation.
You look like a little baby werewolf.
Those are no baby werewolf.
It's called facial hair. Okay?
It's called facial hair.
And sometimes I need it, otherwise I don't have a chin. Good night.
You're not saying anything about werewolves?
Not after what happened.
What happened?
What happened?
Not since that night.
Okay.
The full moon, he's going to be busy chasing the other wolves outside.
Is that what they do? They chase wolves? Each other? They play
They
tag?
play tag.
That's why they're called werewolves. It's actually W-H-E-R.
Oh, that's cute.
Werewolf.
true.
Werewolf. Anyway, if you like this episode, feel free to rate us, review us, like us, subscribe to us, and we'll catch you here next week.
Do you have my book,
What book?
Missouri?
Yeah, I do. I do.
Or did you give it to Ashley?
No, Ashley has her own copy. She's reading it already. She's got like 20 pages left.
All right, let's call it. Rice, what time is it?
The time is, wow, we're late tonight. 21:38. That is 9:38 p.m. That is 9:38 p.m. for those of you who do not know military time. Dee is ready for bed.
I have to go home and shower.
Okay. All right. Good night, Dee.
Good night.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.